Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. Today I'm going to talk about choice. Now, this came up in some conversations I've had with individuals about choice and the way we are influenced by our environment. So, we have relationships with people, we live in a certain culture, a certain society, and these frame our experiences, they frame our reality. And as a result, our identity emerges from this, what we might refer to as this framed reality, this framed experience. So I was born in 1972. I was born in Ottawa, Canada. I grew up at a certain time, a certain place. I had two parents, then I had a stepmother. So these aspects of my life were relational, right? There was a separation. Later on, I became a musician. I met different people. I drank and then quit drinking. So all of these dynamics played out in my life. And from that, there was a series of relationships. So in my discussions with people, they were suggesting that these relationships really define our choices. And this is, I think, a really important point, that we are, as Heidegger talked about and other existential counselors and therapists have talked about, we are thrown into the world. That is, we are thrown into being born in a certain time. We're thrown into a certain body, thrown into a culture, the language, maybe spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs, and so on. So we are thrown into these things. And from there, we then emerge within that frame. Let's think of an identity as a frame. And so in my discussions, they were suggesting that, well, this is really what's creating our identity, and there's no way for us to operate outside of that. That is to say, we are thrown into this environment, our bodies, our culture, our time, place, and so on. And from that, our identity is framed, is created, and that is predicated upon the interconnectedness of us and others. So I accept that we are intersubjective beings. That is, I would even go so far to say, as in terms of us as a self, that a self arguably does not actually exist, that it is a constructed way of understanding experience, but it is not an actual identity per se. So one analogy I often think about is this line in a Rumi poem, which was, there is a pot, but it's the space that we use. So in a similar way, we can say that the self is the space in the pot. Now, what is that space? That becomes the elusive question. So when we start to think about identity, and we start to think about where or from what that identity is constructed, we will look to carry on with that analogy of the pot. We will look to the pot to understand what that space is. And the pot is very much the culture, the time, the body we're in, the language we speak, and so on. So the question is, are we the pot or are we the space in the pot? Well, Rumi's point was, we use the space. That's what we're using with a pot. We don't use the pot per se, yet you could say without the pot, there is no space within the pot. So when we start to think about choice, what does this mean? I think one of the things that was coming up in the discussion was a notion that we didn't choose the pot, therefore we don't have choice. And I entirely concede that point. I entirely concede the point that we were thrown into the pot, right? That we just were given this pot. We went to IKEA, it was on sale, or Canadian Tire, wherever we got our pot, there's our pot, and we're now home with our pot making whatever we're making. Can we decide what we put in that pot? Well, somebody might argue, well, not really, because language structures thought. And from a structuralist perspective, it creates the potential for how we understand things. So propaganda operates principally under this view, which is by sheer repetition, the quote-unquote meaning of something is perpetuated without it ever being questioned. So slogans that are racist, slogans that are sexist, any slogan that is a way of narrowing and persecuting, a way of alienating, is not predicated upon reason. It's predicated upon this repetition, which is why the key tenet of sexism and racism and the key threat that sexist and racist face are being questioned, right? They always try and remove themselves from the questions that they're being asked. They will be angry, they will be dismissive, they will in whatever way negate to protect their mantra, their repeated view. So that's one of the errors in the way of racist and sexist thought is it's predicated upon habit or custom and not upon reason, right? It's not predicated upon a dialectical process of engaging with the merits of or against a certain point. So in that way, we're talking about the sheer repetition. So that becomes, in effect, a kind of metaphysical pot, which is to say, now we're in this situation where we're thinking about connections, and we've defined the interior space of the pot based upon the exterior of the pot, which is that habit, that custom, that way of understanding the world, and we see everything through that lens. So let's step back here for a second. And let's say that I wear some tinted colored sunglasses of some kind. Let's say they're tinted, red. Everything I see will have the tint of red. Does everything, in fact, have red? A. And B, is there such a thing as color in the world? So the answer to number one is, will I see things as something? Yes. The answer to B is, no, there is no color in the world. That's the way in which we process it. So I am seeing something that actually does not exist in the world because I am processing it in a certain way within this larger pot, so to speak, this larger structure. And I'm starting to accept myself as the pot, whereas, going back to the Rumi line, in fact, the self is, by analogy, the space within the pot. Now, another way of thinking about this is the space within the pot is actually potential. So what does that mean? Well, I've got my pot, and what am I going to do with my pot? At that point, I could do any number of things. The pot itself is fixed. It's a certain diameter, it has a certain capacity, a certain volume can go into it, and so on. And so it's fixed. It can withstand a certain amount of heat or whatever. It has a lid, or these are the kinds of attributes of the pot itself as a fixed thing. A fixed thing in time and space. It's kind of thrown into the world. To borrow from the Heideggerian notion, it is thrown into the world. So that doesn't speak to what's in the pot. That doesn't speak to what I do with the pot. What do I make? Well, that's the potential. If I'm really good at cooking, which I am not, then that would increase my potential. If I'm really curious about cooking, which I'm starting to be, then that will increase my potential. But here's the distinction. In being curious, in gaining an understanding, I have to move away from these regimented, habitual ways of thinking. I have to move away from the constructed notion of custom, the constructed notion of culture, the constructed notion of, by analogy, gender, race, and so on, that these are actually artifacts of a habitual way, of a systemized way of looking at things that do not actually exist in the world. In a similar way that red does not actually exist in the world, even though I may see red through my tinted glasses, red does not actually exist in the world. Similarly, the way in which we construct these realities, sexist, racist, and so on, they do not actually exist in the world. So you say, well, of course they do, right? I see people of different, genders, different colors, different this, different that. Well, what are you actually seeing? And this starts to become a little bit more aloof in our current time, which I don't think it will be in the future. So let's back up and, look at this. Why am I saying that? Why am I saying that a certain way of looking at things right now might not be as strange or unfamiliar or might not evoke such feelings of uncertainty and insecurity? So let's take gender as an example. So I'm 48, almost 49. So in grade 3, I was in Mrs. Ventresca's class, and she wrote on the board, he, in reference to he and she. And I said, why is it not he and she? Now, of course, I was in grade 3. I wasn't a feminist, right? I didn't know about any of these things, but I had a mother. My parents were divorced. I had a sensitivity and an awareness that there are women and men. I was drawn to women, drawn to particularly at that age, drawn to a mother figure, and was really attuned to the fact that there are women, there are mothers, there are nurturers, there are fathers, there are men, that there's these dynamics. So the idea that there was one flew in the face of my grade 3 self as not making sense. In other words, the custom of using he to define he and she did not actually represent the world I was seeing. It did not actually represent the world I was reflecting upon. It did not reflect the world I was actively experiencing. This is a point we talk about from time to time, and it comes up here and there as praxis, the idea of theory and practice emerging, that they kind of collide, which is basically thoughts and experience as a dynamic tango, if you will. So we're constantly testing our theories or our ideas against the experience. And my experience of he and she was that I have a mother and I have a father, and they're separated. I have these needs, which I could not articulate for obvious reasons. But I was aware that there was a he and a she, a mom and a dad, a man and a woman, and that just say he did not actually complete or reflect what I was seeing in the world. Now, how does that intersect with what I said, that they don't actually exist in the world? Well, that's the thing. I'm constructing it based upon my experience. My experience is the potential that exists within the pot. It's not the pot itself. My potential, my experience, my lived expression of what he, she, dad, mom, all these kinds of things are, pushed me to say, I can't just say he, I have to say he and she. So again, this is not about me being a kid in grade 3 thinking in terms of feminism or anything like that. It was much more fundamental. I was saying it does not reflect my fundamental needs. And this is where I think we can kind of shift the conversation to something that I've been thinking a lot about. And this came from a friend, and we've talked in letters over the years. And she introduced me a couple of years ago now to somatic therapy, somatic thinking. Now, how does this intersect with what I'm saying about being in grade 3, saying that, he does not represent a more complete picture of he and she? And how does this ultimately intersect with what I was saying about the way in which we're looking at things right now may transform? So in 50 years from now, we'll look back and see this and say, okay, well, the thing that they were struggling with in 2021 is no longer something that we're struggling with. So how do all of these things go together? Fundamentally, from a somatic point of view, I, as a kid, was feeling something about connection, right? I was feeling something about nurturing, family, a whole world, whatever you want to call that. I was fundamentally feeling that, right? That was a natural, you can almost call it a natural, a priori assumption or belief or need that I was a part of this connected world, that even though my parents had separated, had divorced, I still within myself needed to find a way to make it whole, to make it complete. And one of the ways I did that, and people will do different things in different ways, but one of the ways I did that was to say, well, there's a he and a she, not just a he, which had symbolic importance to me. Now, as we start to think about language, and earlier I mentioned that language structures thought, and we start to think about how we structure the thought of the potential in the pot, we're returning to that Rumi line, the notion that we buy a pot, but within the pot, that's the space that we use. And by association, I was making the analogy that that space is really the self, that the self proper does not exist. Rather, it exists within potential. Therefore, we feel compelled to construct a self in such a way that we think is going to be like a pot. And we do that through habit and traditions, for example, routines, ceremony, and so on, to construct the illusion that the self is like the pot. But, as we said, with my tinted glasses, yes, I am seeing things as red, but red does not actually exist in the world. Similarly here, the self does not actually exist in the world. So, when we start to think about what choice means, and we think about it from the perspective of I have a certain number of choices within a fixed world, then we can say, well, I don't have those choices. Right? How can I have these choices if I've been thrown into the world? If I've been thrown into a certain body, a certain age, a certain set of political and religious beliefs, what choices do I actually have? It's entirely determined. The obstacle that we come up against is we're now arguing for determinism. That is, we're saying, well, I don't have any control over the pot, therefore I don't have any control over myself. That's the issue. That's kind of the heart of this podcast. I'm accepting that we have no control over the pot. I'm not saying we do have control over the pot. I'm saying we went to the store, we got our pot, that's our pot, we only have one pot, no more pots. But I am saying we can control what we put into the pot, how we look at the pot, how we experience the pot. And I'm saying we can do that by connecting somatically to our experience. I think the argument tends to focus on, well, yeah, but I learned racism, or I learned these political beliefs, or I was brought up in this culture and they espouse these views, so I have no choice. Yes, I'm not arguing against that. I'm not saying that we are not in a kind of battle against the customs that define our experience. What I am saying is we're having a somatic kind of reaction based upon an a priori understanding of what connection means, of what holism means. So, again, my grade 3 self wasn't a proto-feminist insofar as I was going to one day become a feminist, write about feminism, and so it was a clear indication of my cultural influence or the cultural messaging of feminism. It was really from the somatic need for a child to have a whole unified world. So if we think about that for a second, we move away from this rationalizing notion of, or habit notion really, of what an identity is, how it should or should not work in terms of our social relationships, our political relationships, and all the rest of it. And we step into this idea of a child has a natural, innate need for a holistic experience. If that doesn't happen, as is often the case, that need does not go away. What they are then doing is reacting based upon this fundamental need that is not being met. When this fundamental need is not being met, it is then constructed in some form of thinking world or rational world, which, now let's remember, essentially what we're talking about is crisis, right? The child is going through some crisis state, or the individual is going through some crisis state. And ask yourself, how do we react to uncertainty? Are we comfortable with it? Do we like uncertainty? When we feel uncertainty, we grab onto whatever we can to create certainty, which moves into the realm of custom, moves into the realm of habit, moves into the realm of habitual responses. So if we are moving into habit and custom and habitual responses, and if that's giving us a sense of security, and we use that as the frame of self, then yes, we are entirely without choice. In a radical sense, we have zero choice. Why? Well, if we are defined entirely by the habits and the customs and the rituals of our society, of our culture, then yes, we have said they are addressing the fundamental insecurity that I feel. They are giving me an answer to this fundamental insecurity that I'm experiencing. through my accordance with these customs, these traditions, these habits, and so on. Yet, like the color red, does that actually exist in the world? And does that actually speak to my potential as the space within the pot? No, because I have to forfeit my individual agency in order to find security through this external means. In other words, there's this external realm that says, if you become a part of our club, our group, or this or that, then you will be safe. That is extremely appealing for anybody who feels alienated, anybody who feels like they are lost, like they have, they're isolated. There's no connection. There's no fundamental interconnectivity which mirrors their fundamental need for connection. That is, remember, we are born needing a priori this connection, this sense of it is the fundamental foundation upon which all is built. And we try to create, in whatever way we can, a sense of holism, a sense that everything is connected, even if it comes out through rage, or I would argue, especially when it comes out through rage, as if rage is, in a sense, the indicator of a social pathology that actively oppresses and alienates people. This is where I think the notion of identity, community, and politics kind of smash into each other. Politics enters a whole new power dynamic. It is by nature hierarchical. So we have a structure that's based upon hierarchy, yet we have an innate need for connection. How does that work? How does living in a society that says we have status, we have, you're a better this, you're a worse that, while at the same time, we all want to be loved, we all want to feel connection, we all want to be heard and valued. How do those two fundamentally different principles align? Well, the answer is they don't. And this is where individual choice comes back into play, at least for me. Again, I accept that we are thrown into a world and there's so many things for which we have no choice. Yet, if we as individuals are to move beyond the sense of certainty that is given to us through habit, custom, tradition, and so on, and start to explore our own individual experience, somatic and otherwise, and start to express that, we start to find an evolution of complexity that is more inclusive, not less inclusive. And this is why I think in 50 years from now, I hope, we'll look back and see that, okay, some forms of identity that we struggle with today will, for many people, not be, in many societies and many cultures, not be questions later. Why? Because they become habit. So similarly, discussions today about gender tend to be about the so-called third gender, or they. They tend to be fewer discussions about should we have he or she. Whereas when I was growing up, that was the discussion. So what it suggests, at least tangentially, is we are slowly starting to integrate change and complexity into the habits and customs of our society. It's a slow process, to be sure. Yet it is in some ways happening. And paradoxically, and I use that word literally, we see it because we see increased levels of liberation and increased levels at the same time of oppression. I shouldn't say increased levels, but we're seeing this kind of paradox between, on the one hand, individuals, genders, races, and religious backgrounds, and all these different things are being liberated in ways that are unprecedented, yet they are being strategically kind of zeroed in on, almost surgically zeroed in on, to try and oppress, certainly take away certain rights. So, for example, right now in the United States, the question of a woman's right to choose is very much on the table again somehow. And that is surprising in a society that espouses certain views about liberty, yet it's not surprising when we consider that liberty is structured as a form of habit, right? It's structured as a way in which we understand people habitually. And so, in effect, certainly in the United States, I think an argument can be made that one form, at least, of understanding liberty is as a brand, right? It's kind of a political brand that is used. We have liberty, we have freedom. But to really understand how they are actually enacted, we find that, there's actually a tremendous amount of restrictions, which is why I would say that they are more custom or habit that are politically operationalized than actually individual rights or freedoms, which would be up to the individual through self-actualization to discern. So there's a clear distinction there in my mind. But returning to this idea today of choice and this idea of the pot and this idea of the space in the pot, I kind of invite you to think about this idea of, okay, well, what are things in my life that I have no choice about? What are things in my life that are customs and habits and routines? And what are things in my life that I feel from a somatic level? And what are things in my life that I think I can start to exercise choice over? Now, we can break that final point down a little bit further. When I say, what are things I can exercise choice over? That's a kind of an interesting statement. What does over mean? Well, it means I am pushing myself, and this is a Nietzschean idea of the over person, right? The person who is pushing beyond their constructed views, who in some way or form is recognizing that the world that we conceive is not actually an existent world, insofar as we are building this world. We are conceiving and constructing, and this is a dynamic process. This is not a fixed habitual process. This is not a rigid process. So in the same way, we can move over ourselves in such a way that we can start to explore choice beyond the constructed notions of what those choices have been. So from that perspective, we've acquired and developed and adhered to a series of choices, habits, routines, rituals. What are some things we can start to explore within ourselves? Are there things that when we start to approach or broach exploring these things, we somatically feel unsettled? Are there things that we start to approach or broach that we start to somatically resonate with, that yet on a rational level they don't seem to quote unquote fit into the world? So now what we're doing is we're exploring choice through our bodies, through embodiment. And in exploring choice through our bodies, we're grounding ourselves in our experience. This is not a political or ideological way of looking at ourselves, especially in terms of we're not looking at it through the lens of habit, ritual, custom. What we're doing is we are exploring. Now, one of the things that I think is so striking to me about this is being curious, being open, occurs when we feel safe. So if we can get ourselves into a space where we mentally feel safe, we kind of mentally have this, well, here's actually a way you can kind of test yourself. If you can sit and say why and what and how and ask these questions and feel in no way activated, you can look at oppositional views, you can just explore things, then you have moved into a very open part of your being. You're not creating a set of boundaries that you need to fit in. And for example, if you have a thought like, well, for example, I'm a white middle-aged man, so if I think to myself, okay, well, how am I racist? Now, that could be activating for me. I could think, oh my God, if I'm a racist, I'm this bad person, and I don't want to be a bad person, and people won't like me, and I have these friends, and, That's very panicked. That is not cool, right? That is, the line from Pulp Fiction, the ABCs, you always be cool, and it is not cool. So how do we get ourselves into the cool? How do we find the ABCs? Always be cool. That we do by starting to recognize that some of these habits of thought are constructing a reality that are inherently at odds with our experience. So by being open and saying, okay, well, let me think about the ways in which I am racist, I could be racist, I'm at risk of being racist, and I start to explore them, what I'm doing is I'm allowing myself to start to explore the habits of thought, the patterns of thought, and do so in a way that is about me getting to a feeling place within myself. Now, grounding ourselves within this embodied experience of attunement is a way to really, how do I say this? It's a way to really acknowledge that the truth of our experience is resonating within us all the time. Now, that sounds kind of abstract and maybe even a bit kind of flaky. So what do I mean by that? Think of it this way. If you are doing a task, let's say you're playing a musical instrument, or you're sitting at a computer typing, or you're walking down the street. If all of your muscles are really tight, will that task be easier or harder? So let's think of it in a relational context. You meet somebody and you're just meeting them for the first time and you feel really anxious. Will meeting them be easy or easier than if you felt comfortable? Here's another example. If I go into a situation where I have a tremendous amount of doubt about my ability, will I be relaxed and comfortable in that situation, or will I be anxious and nervous in that situation? So it's the same thing. The metric, or the way in which I'm understanding my relationship, is to say, how am I feeling in this experience? Am I feeling activated? Am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling nervous? How am I feeling? And from there, can I start to think and explore that experience in and of myself? So if we try and tie this all together, we started off and we were asking about choice and relationships. We moved to the Roomy Analogy, thinking about this idea that there is a pot, that we went to Canadian Tire, we got our pot on some Black Friday sale, and we come home, we start cooking. But we ask ourselves, well, am I the pot, or am I actually the space in the pot, by analogy? And from there, we started to ask questions about identity in terms of how we connect to other people and how that defines our relationships. And that occurs through habits and rituals and ceremonies and so on and so forth. Yet, we recognize that there is this embodied or somatic experience, this kind of fundamental need for connection, this fundamental need for family, for community, and so on, that it is operating independently and may challenge some of these constructed notions about, for example, gender. And I gave the example of being in grade 3 and how my experience of going through divorce and my experience of understanding man, woman, mom, dad, this kind of thing, in the context of sitting in a classroom and the teacher writing he, was activating to me insofar as I would say, well, what about, in my mind, my mother, who is what we call, or what is termed a she. So even though I was working in a classroom and working with the custom of using he, it didn't fit my experience, my embodied experience of holism through family, through a mother and a father. And remember, this is in late 70s, early 80s, so divorce wasn't quite so common, certainly not as common as now. So I was already highly aware of the fact that I was, for example, the only kid in the class with divorced parents. So that was a form of difference. So it kind of set me off. And so that example helped to illustrate that there's these customs, there's these traditions, there's these habits, these ways of understanding ourselves in the world that may not reflect our embodied experience. And so then finally we started looking at this idea of attuning ourselves to the embodied experience and the Nietzschean notion of the over-person, that is, that we strive to move past these habits and these constructs that are imposed upon us and understand our embodied experience as this kind of emergent force within our lives, that is, the kind of soil from which everything grows, or the space within a pot, and that's the space that we use to cook. This is an emergent force. This is a potential force. So, and kind of the final thoughts on this question of choice is, yes, choice is limited or restricted if we define choice based upon habits and customs. If we think of choice based upon our embodied experience and the emergent experience of that, then we do have choice. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's often not. Certainly history is lined with individuals who have made incredible sacrifices, who have made choices in the face of horrific customs, racist customs, sexist customs, and said no, said, I do not see myself as being that. I am not that. Who were defiant based solely upon their embodied experience that they knew in their bones that they are beautiful, they are perfect in their own imperfection, they are beautiful in their own pain, they are righteous in their own views, they are connected to something that goes beyond, that is over, again borrowing that Nietzschean notion, or beyond the constructed binary structures that are used in an habitual way to define us, whether that's he, she, or in religious terms, racial terms, and so on, that we are more than these narrow, restricted notions of who we are. We are not the pot. We are the potential within the pot. So here's some thoughts to think about as we, move forward in our lives. And certainly it's something that I think about a lot, is what's going on in my body and how am I connecting? How am I intersecting? And how is that emerging? So if you have any thoughts, as always, you can reach out and find me at jordano'connor.com. There's a tab for the podcast, and there's also a contact tab as well. Otherwise, bye for now.